For 42 years she believed it had been an accident. The house by the water learned the shape of her grief so thoroughly that grief became habit. A place at the table, a wrapped photograph that never left the mantel, a winter coat kept hanging in case a small hand might one day slip back into it. The days arranged themselves around absence. The phone woke her whole world that morning. It was the kind of ring that seems to travel through the bones. She saw the light on the counter like a small sun and moved toward it without thinking. She had learned to answer, even when answering was the hardest thing there was to do. She answers. The voice on the other end is careful. "We need to speak with you," it says. "It's about Kai." For a moment the kitchen holds its breath. The kettle begins to sing, and she lets it sing. If this is finding you now, if the beginning of this voice turns something in you, subscribe to follow the story. There will be more to come. Then the house opens like a book, and everything folds backward. They had gone to the festival because that was what you did with small towns in summer. Blue bunting, paper boats, the smell of frying oil under salt air, music from a stage whose lights stuttered as the sun fell. Lucas had wanted to show Kai how the sea could be a playground. Joanna had wanted to catch images, to freeze the child's face against the light. There was a little catamaran tied to the jetty, its ropes bright with algae. Children ran on the sand, sticky with ice cream. Someone handed Joanna a camera, because she had always had one, because she kept everything that seemed worth remembering. Kai's laughter tumbled through the crowd. He carried a toy boat tucked under his arm, eyes bright the color of the tide. A vendor's bell chimed. Joanna bent to speak to someone, lips moving into an apology or a joke. She could not remember which now. And in that literal second when two halves of the world were not watching, the child's body, small and certain, drifted away. The exact shape of what followed breaks into shards. 1 minute there were sandals left on the sand. 1 minute shoes in a neat row as if the child had planned to return. The next minute there was a hole where a life had been. People shouted. Someone ran to the water. Someone else called for rope, for a boat. The festival continued in the periphery because the world sometimes refuses to stop even when the village's heart tears. They searched until the sky went dark. Torches cut across the water like long, trembling knives. Men who had been at the coffee shop all afternoon joined with fishermen who knew every current. Dogs followed scent lines that offered no answer. In the morning they found a small shoe lodged under a pier, the sole soft with sand. The sea had kept it secret. Grief at first was a raw landscape where everything slid. The town did what towns do. It made a story to live with. Someone said it had been an accident. Someone else said the tide was quick, that small hands could untie knots faster than a brain could follow. They wrapped Kai in a blanket and called it closure. They held a funeral that felt like a small defiance against the tide's indifference. Joanna did not leave immediately. For a while she made silent pilgrimages to the shore. She took out her camera and filmed the waves, the backs of people who had been there that day, the small wind-bent flags at the festival. The camera became an argument with forgetting. She filmed because the film held the possibility of a return that the sea refused to allow. But grief is a narrowing thing. Lucas folded in on himself. He remarried after 2 winters had gone. A woman named Mara moved into the house and learned the rhythm of an absentee husband. She brought quiet dinners and a steadier hand. The town taught itself to say the past in polite tones, and the name Kai began to be mentioned in the same breath as weather forecasts. Occasionally, circumspectly. Joanna left. She took a suitcase and the cameras and the boxes that held the small artifacts of a child who would not grow up. She bound herself to other hands and other rhythms, to a man named Andreas, who was not cruel, but who could not anchor what the sea had taken. She learned to paint the absence into canvases that smelled of turpentine and salt. She called her art memory work, and taught others to bring photographs into a light where they could be seen without breaking. Years pulled like tides. Lucas had 2 daughters with Mara, Marie and Belle. They knew the house as their home, a place with an older photograph tucked behind glass, and a silence at mealtimes people didn't speak over. They learned that their father carried a blankness where a boy should be. They learned to observe the rituals without understanding their full weight. They called Joanna their stepmother's predecessor, When they were children and then as grown women, Joanna with curiosity and a shadow of accusation. Joanna's films were small at first, loops of seagulls and tide pools. Then someone in a local archive unearthed a cardboard box in a town hall storeroom. In it were reels. Child play footage shot on a day that would become a bruise on everyone's life. The reels were unmarked. Dust had stitched them together like time itself. Whoever found them thought they were ordinary festival footage. But when Joanna saw the child's hands on a rope, the angle of the sun on his cheek, her hands, accustomed to freezing things, began to move. She took the reels into a dark room and watched. The projector hummed. The image stuttered as if remembering breath. On the film, Kai ran toward a pier. He turned his face into the sunlight. He waved at someone off camera. The reel held music from the band, the crowd's indifferent applause. There was, for a single frame, a man's silhouette near the jetty, someone who did not look like the fisherman you could name. It was passing. It might mean something, or it might mean nothing at all. Film is a liar and a truth-teller at the same time. It promises clarity and delivers questions. Joanna edited. She cut scenes together with scissors and a kind of ruthless tenderness. Her film became an act of devotion, to make a memory public, to say his name out loud in a place that had tried to tidy away the pain. She invited Lucas. He came because something in him still trusted the small frame of the camera, even when trust had been burned. Marie and Belle came because they wanted to understand why there were old photographs missing and why their father could not fully be present. The premiere was in the small-town theater where everyone went to see plays and municipal announcements. The screen pulled breath in the dark. Citizens who had known Kai came with courtesy and with something harder, a wish to be absolved without examination. The film began with the sea like a slow, indifferent mouth. It showed a child's hand. It showed a rope. It showed the festival as a cathedral of ordinary joys that had become, overnight, landscape of absence. When the scene with the silhouette flashed, someone in the back made a small, involuntary sound like a cough. Others shushed them as if the sound could be sewn closed. Joanna sat in the shadow of the projection and felt the film's light wash over her face like an accusation and a benediction at once. She had made the work as a way to hold him. She had not expected it to make anyone uncomfortable. After the screening, applause felt like a bandage. People clapped because that was what people did. They clapped for the craft, for Joanna's bravery. But as people left, whispers stuck like seaweed between teeth. One neighbor, who had been a fisherman for 40 years, caught Lucas's arm in the narrow alley and said, "You kept a box in the shed, didn't you?" Lucas's jaw tightened. He looked at Joanna as if she had invented the question with the reel. Marie watched the exchange, a thin, careful anger beginning to heat. Arguments bloom out of half-truths. At home, late into the night, they argued about film and memory as if those could be abstracted into tidy colors. "You took our family to the public square to be judged," Lucas said. Joanna's face was a map of years. "I wanted him to exist somewhere people couldn't forget," she said. "You threw away a photograph," Lucas answered, the sentence a sudden arrow. "No, I hid it. I didn't want your new life to be suffocated by the past." The older accusation hung in the air like a thing that could be picked up and hurled. Marie and Belle, who had grown up around the silence, had their own inventories of resentment. They asked about what was missing. They demanded to know who had chosen which photograph to keep and which to toss. They accused quietly and without ceremony. Who decided we should be whole while his memory became dust? Joanna could not answer. Lucas could not either. What was left between them were three categories: what was remembered, what was forgotten, and what was deliberately hidden. The film, intended as an ode, had opened a wound instead. But it had also done something else. It had made small, private objects become public. That is how attention works. When the world looks, people who thought themselves safe in their silence feel compelled to move. It was in the echo of that premiere, in the week after the applause and the arguments, that the phone call came, the one that had woken her that morning. The voice had said they needed to speak, that something new had been brought to light, that an officer would like to see her. to view the footage and to ask questions. New evidence suggests we should reconsider the circumstances, the caller said with the careful cadence of someone closing and opening doors. They did not say what the evidence was. They did not suggest a perpetrator. They only asked politely to reopen an archive that had been left to rot. For Joanna, the call did not so much reopen as it peeled away a scab. "We need to speak with you about Kai," the voice had said. Her hands went to the box of reels like a woman greeting a long-absent child. The decision to go to the meeting was not a single, clean thing. It was a muscle memory of wanting answers, and also of wanting to protect what little remained of him. She thought of the camera's viewfinder as a small hunger for truth. At the same time, truth can be a perilous thing to invite into a room that has built so many polite doors. They met in a municipal building, whose chairs smelled faintly of varnish and old coffee. The person who spoke did not offer specifics that would make the story into a neat headline. "Investigators have reviewed new material," they said. "We are asking to view original reels and to speak with those who may have information." There were phrases meant to balance curiosity and legality. No accusations at this stage. A routine re-examination. Indefinido is what the press might have called it if they wanted a label. Instead, the speaker gave a sparse, careful invitation. Joanna's throat tightened. Lucas sat on the other side of the table. He had not expected her to attend. He had not expected, perhaps, to be able to recognize the face that grief had become. Going public meant letting others into what had been a private altarpiece. Joanna felt nervous, not for herself but for Kai. She imagined the reels in the hands of technicians who measured truth in frames per second. She imagined them finding something small and shattering. Yet she also felt that after 4 decades, any path that might lead to an answer was worth the risk. Word moved through the town with the thin speed of gossip and the heavy persistence of something that has been unburied. People who had once murmured comfort now cleared their throats and asked direct questions as if they had a stake in the story's final paragraph. "Did you always suspect?" they asked Joanna. "I never stopped looking," she said. She had looked in years of art, in the grain of photographs, in the faces of people who might have been near that jetty. The daughters watched the family unspool with the same combination of fascination and horror that comes from seeing a house creak under its own long history. Marie wanted the truth because truth would examine what she had been taught to accept. Belle wanted the truth because it might be proof that her father's nights of drink and silence had not been only weakness, but pain he had held with integrity. For them, the police call was permission, to ask the questions they had been taught not to voice. The reels were placed on a table with the solemnity of relics. Joanna handled them like a mother ghost. The projector was set up again, not for art now, but for inquiry. The room was a small lighthouse of curiosity. The film spooled and dazzled, and the images regained their weight. Kai's freckled nose caught in sunlight, his little fingers grasping a rope, a blade of seaweed tucked in the hem of his play clothes. When the angle of the camera slid and a shadow appeared near the pier, the room inhaled. The shadow could be nothing. It could be everything. Investigators asked questions that were gentle by necessity and unsteady by design. "Do you recognize this person?" "Were there people who favored that key?" Joanna answered what she could. Lucas answered what he could, which was not always the same. Memory sits unevenly. There were things each had chosen to keep to themselves. An extra morning when Lucas had been asked to fetch supplies. A neighbor who had teased the children and then avoided them later. A photograph in a shoebox that one of the daughters could not reconcile with the neat rows of pictures on the mantel. No single answer stitched the narrative closed. The possibility of foul play was not asserted by anyone sitting around the projector. Instead, investigators used tentative language, the language of a reopening. New evidence suggests, a witness may have recalled, there is material we would like to analyze. That was all. Those happenstance phrases were enough to open old grief into new territory. They gave people a framework to demand more, of each other, and of the town that had allowed silence to settle like fog. Arguments resumed with the force of weather. Lucas accused Joanna of seeking attention. Joanna accused him of handing over too much to the world by living a softer, domesticated life that asked his children to be the caretakers of memory by default. Marie accused both parents of having lives that made standing still easier than staring into a 40-year-old void. Belle demanded the originals, the ones someone had thrown away, the one that would prove or disprove what the town had decided some years ago. There was a scene none of them wanted to stage, the confrontation at the bridge. It was late afternoon when Joanna went to the old pedestrian bridge that arched over the inlet, the place Kai had once used as a leaning point to watch the boats. She found Lucas already there, hands in his pockets, the setting light cutting his profile into the silhouette of a man who had been weathered by something other than time. The bridge held a kind of precinct of memory. "You left," Lucas said simply, as if it were a matter of fact. She turned her face to the sea and the gulls that had watched the whole thing happen and had claimed it to the sky. "I didn't know how to stay," she said. Staying meant living in a body that smelled like a wound. I searched for ways to make it something else. "You left an empty chair," he said. "You left me to carry everything." "And what would you have done differently?" she asked. "Would you have stopped the tide with your hands?" They argued not to vilify the other, but to break the seams of what had been left unspoken. The truth was messy. Love had been present in both of them. Warped, misdirected, fierce. The police call had not chosen sides. It had simply put the old bones of the town's story on the table and invited the living to assemble them anew. Back at the house, the reels became contested objects. Someone suggested turning over duplicates to the investigators for forensic analysis. Another argued for preserving the original and sending copies. "If you give them the originals, you risk losing them to bureaucracy," said Mara, Lucas's second wife, who had learned the difference between grief and daily duty. "If you don't, you'll be accused of hiding things." Accusation and defense folded into each sentence like two halves of a tide. There was a moment when Joanna opened a small wooden box she had kept for 42 years. Inside were photographs she had hidden from the world. Kai at the edge of the pier, hair stubborn with salt. Kai asleep against her chest. Kai laughing. There was one she had always kept folded in her palm as if touch could keep memory intact. She handed it to Marie with fingers that trembled. "He was the most beautiful child in the world," she murmured, and the sentence landed in Marie's lap like a confession. It needed no rebuttal. It was an offering. Marie studied the photo as if trying to reconcile two eras in one glance. The child she never met in life, and the man grieving her father who had memorized the boy's face. "Why was it hidden?" she asked. Joanna's answer was simple. She wanted both to keep him sacred and to protect the family that had not been able to shoulder the rawness along with her. The town found itself in divided positions. Some supported a full re-examination. Others began to circle the past like wary dogs, reluctant to bear new wounds. The premier had produced applause and then silence. The police inquiry produced a similar sequence. Civil gestures followed by an underside of fear. People who had been in the crowd that day 42 years earlier returned with stories they had not thought themselves brave to tell. Against this communal swirl, Joanna continued to edit. Perhaps art was the only thing she understood as a way to make grief less solitary. She took the footage and made a longer piece, part documentary, part elegy, piecing together fragments of the festival, of the pier, of Kai's short life as it existed within frames. She layered sound. A child's laughter, the distant band, the hush of the tide. She left pauses where the screen went black as if to let the audience breathe the absence. Her film was not a verdict. It was a witness. At a second screening, this one held at the town hall for invited people, the room felt like an inquest better than a celebration. Investigators were present as guests of a kind. People who had been teenagers at the time of the disappearance were now gray at the temples, their faces a map of years and regrets. Someone whispered a name that no one could place. Someone else said the name could not be verified. The film had made memory a public thing, and public memory is a dangerous and gentle force. Then, one evening after the screening had ended and the chairs had been folded away, a neighbor knocked on Lucas's door. He said he had been a boy who had seen things he was never supposed to name. He had kept a silence that felt like an inheritance. Now, he said, He had turned 90 and could not bear the weight of his eyes anymore. He wanted to tell what he had seen, he said, but he wanted to keep his dignity. He asked that his statement be handled with care. The town had a new witness, or at least a man who claimed to be that. The film, by way of public attention, had created space for such accounts to emerge. That was the sort of thing that causes polite phrases to disintegrate into more urgent words. New evidence suggests moved from hypothetical to probable, and the police asked to see original footage, to speak with Joanna again, to have her provide copies. They did not say who might be accused if accusations were ever to come. They only said that someone had come forward with a memory, and in memory there is both clarity and the fog of time. The mounting pressure made the family do a thing they had not done in generation. They sat in a kitchen and, for once, let their voices rise together rather than against one another. Lucas said he had once taken a photograph from a drawer and torn it up because he could not bear to see the boy's smile where there was no boy to answer it. Joanna said she had kept a handful because she could not throw him away. Marie said she had found a box of discarded photos in the basement and had felt anger like a live thing. Belle said she had always suspected the town loved its own comfort more than it loved truth. No one wanted to be cruel, said Mara, who had been there to steady them in the hard years. They wanted safety. Her words were neither absolution nor condemnation. They were a simple fact. In the weeks that followed, the investigators requested the reels formally. They said they would analyze them for anything that might have been missed. They asked to speak with neighbors. They asked to check municipal records, to look at boat logs, to re-interview people. Their language was legal, careful, but the town understood the meaning beneath it. The past had been returned to the hands of those who keep watch. There was a crucial scene, one that felt like a hinge in the house itself. Joanna took a reel, the original reel, the one that had been almost entirely kept secret, and placed it into a courier's box. She could keep it, she thought, and guard the fragile thing like a relic, or she could hand it over and invite whatever would come. Her fingers trembled as she wrote her name on the chain of custody sheets. Giving it away felt like both surrender and faith. She did not know if the reel would tell them anything decisive. She only knew that her son had wanted to be known. The courier took the box. A town. Silence followed, thick and expectant. That night, in the quiet, Joanna dreamt of Kai running on the sand and then growing into a man whose hands were like other men's hands and who had warm and ordinary disappointments. She woke with tears she could not explain, tears that were both grief and relief. The meeting with the investigators was scheduled for a midweek afternoon at a civic office where the air smelled of paper and a faint disinfectant. Joanna arrived with the director of her small film project, a woman who had become a friend and an ally in the construction of memory. Lucas came because he wanted to be present and because there was a piece of pride that kept him from being absent when the family mattered most. Marie and Belle came, seats stiff beneath them. The room held a strange light, like a stage before the curtain rose. They were told that someone had come forward. The person had seen something, or thought they had, and believed it merited re-examination. The investigators did not say that a crime had been discovered. They did not say the case had been solved. They said they had to follow truth where it led, and sometimes truth led to very small doorways that opened into vast corridors. "We cannot promise a conclusive answer," an investigator said, "but we will follow what the evidence suggests." Joanna watched the investigator's face for signs of certainty and found only the steady professional neutrality that comes from long familiarity with partial truths. She felt at once exposed and oddly empowered. There was permission to ask questions that had long been off limits. There would be interviews. There would be a possibility that witnesses' memories stirred by film and time might yield something tangible. Or they might not. "What if it turns out to be nothing?" Marie asked, the sentence a brittle thing that crumpled when spoken. "What will we do with that?" She wanted answers not only about Kai, but about the shape of their own lives that had been built around a missing person. "We will have known as much as we can," Joanna said, "and then we'll decide how to carry it forward." It was not a heroic line. It was practical and true. They left the meeting with appointments penciled into calendars and with a sense that nothing would be the same. The town's gossip moved like smoldering tinder. Some felt vindicated, some felt exposed, some observed from a distance with that dispassionate interest that towns practice to keep their own nights uncluttered by other people's grief. They decided to put on a public screening of Joanna's film, this time with an informational preface prepared by the investigation. Only a factual paragraph explaining that the case had been reopened and that certain materials were being reviewed. The screening felt less like an act of closure and more like a step toward communal truth-telling. People came, they listened, they watched, they wept in a way that was less private now because privacy had been declared impossible. After the screening, the investigators asked to examine the project's raw materials, the reels splices, any correspondence that might indicate someone had seen or known something and not said it. The request was formal and measured. Joanna gave them the copy she had and agreed to provide the originals through the proper channels. The confrontation that followed was quieter than some had expected. No one in the town shouted accusations into the street. There were no arrests, no sensational headlines. The police did not pronounce guilt. They said they had a lead, and they would pursue it. The lead's nature remained indefinito. That was the only honest descriptor. The story's new pulse was procedural rather than decisive. For some, that was intolerable. For others, it was the beginning of a slow, careful unpeeling. In the house, after the investigators had gone back to their office and their measured ways, Joanna and Lucas sat together as awkwardly as children forced to share a bench. They had, for many years, been like two mariners who had watched the same ship sink and now had to rebuild from splinters. They spoke in fragments. "I kept a picture," Lucas said, surprising them all with the admission. "I thought, maybe if I kept it, we'd have something we could agree on." Joanna looked at him. "I kept more," she said. "I couldn't throw him away when everyone else did." "What did we do?" Marie asked, the question suddenly small and perfectly ordinary for how long it had been heavy. "What we could," Belle answered. "And what we could not." There was no neat reconciliation, but there were small acts of mending. They put a photograph in a frame they had never used before, and placed it on the mantel between the children who belonged in the house and the memory that would not. They sat for a while and listened to the sea. The day folded into night with a tenderness that had nothing to do with answers and everything to do with the decision to remain present. The police set a date for a by-appointment interview with Joanna. It was not a dramatic moment on screen, but it was a hinge in private life. She cleaned the house with motions that were ritual. She looked at the reel boxes one last time before she locked them in a cupboard. She dressed as someone who intended to be accounted for. She went because she had to know whether memory would deliver anything in exchange for the courage she had mustered. On the appointed day, she met with the investigators. They showed her some frames and asked about faces. They did not show everything. They were careful because the law is an instrument that must not be used for spectacle. In the conversation there were silences like little tests. Joanna answered what she could. She did not pretend to certainty where certainty was impossible. The investigators asked her if she would be willing to donate original copies to proper archives, if the investigation concluded there was evidentiary value in them. Joanna said yes. She reluctantly offered the reels because she had come to believe that some things are held not for the comfort of memories but for the sake of truth. She realized that the camera's promise was not simply to keep, but to reveal. At the end of the interview, the investigators did not say that they had found a smoking gun. They only scheduled follow-ups. "We have a lead we want to pursue," one of them said. "We have a witness whose memory has been reawakened by the film. We will follow it and see where it leads." The words were careful. They offered no finality. That was the rhythm of the story now. Slow, careful, poised between hope and the possibility of another dead end. Joanna left the building and walked the streets with a feeling of being both emptied and full. She had offered what she could. She had handed her son once again to the architecture of search. Whether that gesture would yield anything more than a clear conscience was indefinido. But she had learned that waiting could be active. It could involve doing what was possible to make the past legible. The next weeks were a blur of interviews and small municipal procedures. Investigators visited the town. asked questions, listened. Someone else arrived from another jurisdiction to review the footage with a different set of eyes, mindful of the passage of time but also trained in technologies that did not exist when Kai vanished. They looked for details, a jacket's color, a fisherman's gait, a hitch in someone's story. Nothing stood as a verdict. The process was a forensic dance of possibility and doubt. There were nights when Joanna could not sleep. She would go to the box of photos and unspool the life she had kept in images. She would watch the reel's copies in her living room and hear his laugh like a bell across a harbor. She would pick up a small shoe and set it on the windowsill as if on a boat. These small acts were both insult and comfort to the absence. The town changed in minor ways. People who had been aloof came around to ask how the family was doing. Some were genuine, some were pursuing a taste of drama. Joanna accepted both as part of being alive in a place where everyone had once known everything about each other. She found that exposure had its strange mercy. Those who had been ashamed could come clean without fear of social oblivion. Those who had been indifferent could no longer be so. A month after the call in the late afternoon, as the light slanted gold through the kitchen window and the sea air came in like an old friend, Joanna set a reel on the projector for herself. The film whirred, and the child's laughter spilled into the room. She let the images unfold like a prayer. At the end of the reel, she reached out and placed a framed photograph on the mantel she had never hung. The photograph caught the light and threw it back, as if to say the boy's life, though measured in such small minutes, still had a dignity the town could not erase. The investigation, for all its procedural vagueness, had given the family a kind of permission. Permission to ask questions. Permission to be vulnerable. That is a small consolation. It does not erase the lack. It does not produce names or clear outcomes. It only moves the search from private memory to public process. On the last night of the script's telling, the town gathered under an indifferent sky. It was not a grand assembly. People came in the way one visits a place of old wounds, not to witness the end of something, but to be present to the beginning of a new kind of story. The projector spun one final time. The film flickered on the white wall of the community center and showed again Kai's small hand in his father's, then a long shot of the pier where a silhouette moved like a question mark in the frame. People watched in silence that was a little more kind than before. In the lobby afterward, Joanna stood by the doorway. She felt the press of other people's faces as if tide were against a seawall. The investigators, who had been in the crowd as quiet observers, came to her and asked if she would meet them the next week to go over another witness statement. They did not promise outcomes. They promised diligence. She nodded. She felt the old ache and under it a small and stubborn hope. It had been 42 years of learning to live around absence. Now the absence took a different shape. Not a sealed book, but one with the hint of pages being turned. That alone changed her posture to the world. It did not bring Kai back. It did not give them the neatness of a solution, but it allowed the family to gather at the table of inquiry and to ask the questions that grief had made unspeakable. As the crowd dispersed, Joanna walked to the harbor. The bridge was a darker ribbon against the water. Down by the quay, a child chased a paper boat someone else had made, and the boat dipped and survived a small series of waves. Joanna smiled in a way she had not done for a long time. She let the reel of memory run alongside the reel of the present. She could not know whether the investigation would find closure or simply more questions, but she had put her son's life into a public stream, and the stream had begun to move. That night she placed the remaining reel on the bedside table. In the dark, she could hear the house breathe. The photograph on the mantel caught the lamplight and threw a small patient face into the room. Her hand found the frame and lingered. "We'll see this through," Lucas said when she spoke to him on the phone later. His voice was older and softer than the one that had made promises 4 decades ago. He did not promise answers. He promised not to be alone in seeking them. The next step, a meeting date, an appointment, the arrival of a witness statement, was set. It was not the conclusion of a story. It was a hinge, an opening into the uncertain architecture of truth. There would be interviews to come, examinations that might yield nothing and might yield something. The police had asked to examine materials and follow leads. They had not announced guilt. They had announced only a willingness to look again. Joanna looked at the reels one more time before she closed the cupboard. The projector hummed softly in her memory, the child's laugh like a buoy. She felt a small, private steadiness. Not peace, not ease, but the knowledge that memory had been summoned into the light. In that light, the town could no longer tidy the past into a comfortable narrative. It would have to hold complexity. In the weeks to come, the investigation would move on its slow, careful gears. There would be interviews, re-interviews, documents to produce, perhaps a witness whose recollection changed with time. There might be nothing, an outcome as possible as any other. But the phone call, that abrupt intrusion 42 years in, had done its work. It had reframed a family's long sorrow as a matter for inquiry, and in doing so it had given them permission to ask, to press, to keep living without the pretense that the past had been concluded. The film reel still sat on the projector in the dark room of Joanna's house. She wound it with the steady, practiced hands of someone who had learned the patience of unspooling memory. When she fed it into the machine and let the lamp bloom, the images poured out. A boy, a rope, a tide. The reel turned like an offered palm. It did not answer every question. It did not banish the years, but it spoke with the particular honesty of footage. What was visible remained visible, and what was missing pressed like a hollow in the screen. She switched off the machine and walked to the window. The bridge glowed under the evening light. On the mantel, the new photograph reflected the room back to her. She held the frame and set it against the glass as if to make the small life into a companion to the night. For 42 years she had believed it was an accident. The police call had changed the grammar of her belief. Accident was no longer the final assertion. It had been recategorized as a possibility among others. She had been given the right to ask again, to seek, to hand over evidence if needed, to let public inquiry follow whatever thread might surface. The reel ran once more, quietly, and in the images Kai's laughter seemed to linger, patient and incorruptible. The meeting the police had set would come next week. She would go. Lucas and his daughters would go. The town, which had learned to cushion its own conscience with quiet, would watch and whisper and wait. At night, in the house by the water, Joanna set the photograph down and covered it with a cloth, not to hide it but to protect it until the morning. She slept with the television off and the window slightly open so she could hear the tide. The world was not fixed. The past still leaned out of its seam to make demands. The call had not solved anything. It had only reopened the file and given the family a small but crucial permission to ask, to hand over those delicate objects of memory, and to follow a lead that might one day rewrite the way they all carried Kai's absence. Outside, a reel continued to spin in an archive where men and women in civil dress and quiet voices would watch for details. Inside, a photograph caught the lamplight and sent it back as a small, stubborn glow. The town's nights would still have their old rhythms. The sea would still be indifferent. But the family had reclaimed an active role in the story. They had refused to let habit alone shape their memory of what had happened. When the investigators called to confirm the next meeting, Joanna answered without hesitation. She had learned to answer the phone as though the action itself was an act of faith. She listened to the familiar, cautious cadences over the line, and then she said simply, "I'll be there." She hung up and sat in the dark for a long time, feeling the house buffeted by wind and sea and memory. She did not know whether the coming days would offer closure or simply more questions. She did not know whether the town would find itself ashamed or relieved. She only knew one unarguable fact. The phone call had changed everything. It had made the private public, and in that change there was a fragile chance for truth to find a slit of light. The reel's hum became a quiet lullaby in her head as she drifted into sleep. In the morning she would meet them. She would hand over the original files if asked. She would answer the questions that had been stored in her like coins. And when she stepped out that day, the sea would be there as it had always been, unchanged, necessary, indifferent, and at the same time cruelly honest in the way it kept what it gathered. The investigation was only beginning. The appointment was set. The family breathed together, and for the first time in a long time, something that looked like hope threaded itself cautiously through the house. The reel on the projector spun on and on, A coin in the slot of memory, giving up images, giving up small truths, and asking nothing but to be looked at.